You ever notice how people start whispering when you walk into a room? Not because you're loud, not because you're dangerous, but because you're different. See the funny thing about power? Real power doesn't scream. It doesn't beg for attention. It just exists. And that terrifies people. They can't measure you. They can't predict you. They can't control you. So what do? They create stories. They say you're lucky. They say you're manipulative. They say you're into something dark. Some of them even whisper, "You must be using forbidden magic." Isn't that adorable? Because when ordinary minds witness extraordinary energy, they don't call it discipline. They don't call it vision. They don't call it spiritual alignment. No, they call it witchcraft. Why? Because your confidence exposes their insecurity. Your growth exposes their stagnation. Your silence exposes their noise. And here's the punchline. Witches aren't scared of magic. They're scared of you realizing you don't need it. You don't cast spells. You cast presence. You don't summon demons. You summon focus. And the most dangerous thing about you, you're just getting started. So tonight, let's talk about why your power terrifies actual witches, why they're convinced you're playing with forbidden forces, and why the real secret is far darker than they could ever imagine. Smile. Because chaos, it's not around you, it's inside you. And it's finally waking up. The moment you walk into a room, something shifts. Conversations hesitate for half a second. Eyes lift. Energy re-announcing yourself. You're not demanding attention. Yet attention bends toward you anyway. That's not noise. That's presence. And to people who live in constant performance mode, presence feels supernatural. Most people rely on volume, status, or validation to feel powerful. They need applause to confirm their existence. But you don't beg the room to notice you. You simply stand in it, grounded, aware, controlled, and that control unsettles them. Because when someone doesn't seek approval, they can't be manipulated. They try to decode you. Why are you so calm? Why don't you overact? Why don't you overshare? Why does your silence feel louder than their words? They search for tricks, tactics, hidden rituals. Surely there's some spell you're casting. Surely there's some forbidden formula you're using. But there isn't. Your magic is self-mastery. You observe more than you speak. You listen more than you reveal. Your emotions don't leak out uncontrollably. You don't chase chaos, you let chaos expose itself. And when you finally speak, your words carry weight because they weren't thrown around carelessly. That restraint feels dangerous to people who are used to emotional outbursts and shallow validation. They can't predict you. And unpredictability, when combined with composure, feels like dark power. Think about it. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. The most powerful is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it. The one who stands still while everyone else scrambles. The one whose eye contact feels like it sees through excuses. The one whose smile feels calculated, not desperate. That's why your presence feels like a spell. It's not mystical. It's psychological. You've detached from the need to be liked, and that detachment gives you leverage. When you don't need something from people, they feel it. They sense the independence, and independence is intimidating to those who survive on approval. Your energy says, "I know who I am." That sentence alone terrifies insecure minds, because when someone knows who they are, they can't be easily shaken. Insults don't land the same. Manipulation doesn't stick. Drama doesn't hook them. They become still water, and still water reflects everything clearly. So others start projecting. They call you mysterious, intimidating, cold, strategic. They assume there's something hidden behind your calm surface. Something forbidden. Something secret. They don't realize the secret is discipline. You've learned to control your reactions. You've trained your focus. You've faced your insecurities instead of running from them. And that internal work radiates outward, like an invisible aura. People feel it before they understand it. And because they don't understand it, they label it as something mystical. But what really scares them is this: you're not reacting to their energy. You're influencing it. Rooms adjust around centered people. Emotions stabilize around grounded individuals. Even chaos hesitates around someone who refuses to feed it. That influence feels like sorcery to those who thrive on emotional turbulence. Your presence forces others to confront themselves. Your calm exposes their anxiety. Your confidence exposes their doubt. Your silence exposes their need to be heard. And when people are forced to see their own instability reflected back at them, they look for something to blame. So they blame magic. They blame dark energy. They blame something strange. Because admitting that you simply did the inner work would mean they have no excuse left. And that truth is far more terrifying than any spell could ever be. Silence makes people uncomfortable. Not noise, not confrontation, not even chaos. Silence. Because in silence there are no distractions, no cover, no performance. Just truth hanging in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. Most people rush to fill empty space. They talk to avoid being seen. They overshare to avoid being questioned. They laugh too quickly, explain too much, defend too fast. Words become shields. But when you choose silence, you put the shield down, and somehow that makes you more dangerous. When someone throws an insult and you don't react, it confuses them. They expect defense. They expect anger. They expect explanation. Instead, they get stillness, and that stillness forces them to sit with their own words. Suddenly, the attack feels weaker, smaller, almost foolish. Silence shifts power. The one who reacts loses control. The one who observes holds it. You've learned that not every comment deserves a response. Not every challenge deserves engagement. Not every provocation deserves energy. And that restraint feels like a weapon to people who are ruled by impulse. They wonder what you're thinking. That's the part that unsettles them. If you argue back, they can predict the direction. If you shout, they know they hit a nerve. But when you go quiet, when your face stays unreadable and your posture stays relaxed, they lose their map, and people fear what they cannot map. Silence creates space. In that space, others start revealing themselves. They talk more. They explain more. They expose insecurities, trying to fill the gap you refused to fill. The more they speak, the more they unravel. And you didn't have to do anything but remain still. That's power. Because the loudest voice often reveals the weakest position. When someone is confident, they don't need to dominate the air. They don't need to win every exchange. They don't need the last word. Silence becomes proof of security. And security is intimidating. Your silence says, I'm not threatened. Your silence says, I don't need validation. Your silence says, you don't control my emotional state. That message hits harder than any comeback ever could. There's also discipline in silence. It takes strength to pause when you want to react. It takes awareness to notice your emotions rising and choose not to let them take over. Anyone can explode. Few can remain composed. When you stay calm under pressure, you disrupt the emotional rhythm of the room. Others expect escalation. They prepare for drama. But you don't feed it. You let it starve. And starved chaos either collapses or exposes itself. Silence also protects information. The less you reveal, the harder it is for others to manipulate you. People can only use what you give them. When you speak less, you give less ammunition. You become harder to read, harder to predict, harder to influence, and unpredictability combined with calm feels lethal. But your silence isn't emptiness. It's calculation. It's awareness scanning the environment. It's emotional control choosing timing over impulse. When you finally speak, your words carry precision. They're measured, intentional, sharp, because they weren't rushed. People start associating your quietness with authority, not because you demand respect, but because you don't chase it. When someone doesn't fight for dominance, they often end up owning it naturally. And the truth is, silence forces others to confront themselves. Without your reaction to bounce off of, they're left alone with their behavior, and many people don't like what they see when there's no distraction. That's why silence feels threatening. It exposes. It destabilizes. It shifts control without noise. And in a world addicted to constant expression, the person who masters restraint doesn't just participate in the game. They control it. Confidence is a mirror most people don't want to look into. Not because it's loud, not because it's arrogant, but because it reflects everything they've been avoiding about themselves. When you walk with certainty, when your voice doesn't tremble with doubt, when your decisions don't require a committee's approval, something subtle happens. The insecure don't feel inspired. They feel exposed. Your confidence highlights their hesitation. You make choices without apologizing for existing. You speak without shrinking your tone. You take up space without asking permission. And to someone who has spent years minimizing themselves to fit into rooms, that feels almost offensive. They start questioning you.
Why are you so sure?
Who do you think you are?
Why are you acting like that? But those questions aren't really about you. They're about the discomfort rising inside them. Because your certainty reminds them of their fear. Confidence forces comparison, not because you demand it, but because your presence creates it naturally. When you believe in yourself, it becomes obvious who doesn't. When you trust your path, it becomes clear who is lost. When you move decisively, it exposes who is paralyzed by overthinking. And people don't like being reminded of their paralysis. So instead of confronting their insecurity, they project it onto you. They label you arrogant. They say you're too much. They whisper that you're full of yourself. It's easier to attack visible confidence than to build invisible self-worth. But real confidence isn't loud superiority. It's quiet stability. It's knowing your strengths without exaggerating them. It's accepting your flaws without collapsing because of them. It's understanding that you don't need universal approval to validate your existence. And that independence creates tension in those who rely on approval as emotional oxygen. When you stop seeking validation, you remove the power others have over you. Compliments don't inflate you. Criticism doesn't shatter you. You listen, you evaluate, and you move forward. That emotional balance is unsettling to someone who swings wildly between ego and insecurity. They expect you to react strongly. They expect your pride to be fragile. They expect you to crumble under pressure. But when you remain steady, when your self-belief doesn't flicker under scrutiny, it disrupts their expectations. Confidence also changes body language. Eye contact becomes direct. Movements become deliberate. Speech becomes measured. There's no rush to impress, no urgency to prove. And that calm self-assurance feels dominant without trying to be. People pick up on that instinctively. Humans are wired to detect hierarchy and stability. When someone appears grounded and self-trusting, others subconsciously register it as strength. And if they don't feel strong themselves, that contrast can sting. Your confidence says, I am enough. For someone battling internal narratives of inadequacy, that statement hits like a spotlight. It illuminates every self-doubt they've buried, every dream they postponed, every risk they were too afraid to take. Instead of asking how you built your self-belief, they question its legitimacy. They assume you must be faking it. They wait for you to slip. They anticipate failure, just to confirm their belief that confidence is an illusion. But authentic confidence doesn't need constant reinforcement. It's built quietly through experience, self-reflection, and resilience. It grows every time you survive something that once intimidated you. It strengthens every time you choose courage over comfort. And when you embody that strength consistently, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because deep down, the insecure recognize real confidence. They just don't always know how to face what it reveals about themselves. Growth is uncomfortable to witness when you've chosen comfort over evolution. When someone begins to change, to level up, to outgrow old habits and old environments, it disrupts the unspoken agreement of staying the same. You didn't just wake up different. You struggled. You sacrificed. You endured loneliness. You questioned yourself. You rebuilt your mindset piece by piece. But people rarely see that part. They only see the transformation. And transformation looks suspicious to those who never started. When you break patterns they're still trapped in, it feels unnatural to them. When you discipline yourself while they indulge impulses, it feels extreme. When you detach from negativity while they feed on it, it feels calculated. They don't call it growth. They call it, "You've changed." And there's weight behind that phrase. It's not curiosity. It's accusation. Because your evolution silently challenges their stagnation. Your new standards expose their old excuses. Your improved boundaries highlight where they have none. And instead of asking how you did it, they question why you think you deserve it. To someone who refuses to grow, growth looks like rebellion. You stopped tolerating disrespect. You stopped entertaining drama. You stopped shrinking to maintain comfort. That shift alone threatens the balance of relationships built on your former compliance. When you raise your standards, access to you becomes earned, not automatic. And people who benefited from your old version may resent the new one. They'll say you're acting different. They'll say you think you're better. They'll suggest you've been influenced by something strange, something external, something forbidden. Because admitting that you simply decided to evolve would force them to confront the fact that they could too. Growth demands accountability. It requires facing flaws without denial. It requires replacing excuses with effort. It requires discipline where there was once distraction. And many people would rather criticize visible progress than attempt invisible work. Your improvement becomes a mirror. It reflects their procrastination. It reflects their fear of discomfort. It reflects the goals they talk about but never pursue. So instead of being inspired, they become defensive. They look for shortcuts in your success. They assume luck. They assume manipulation. They assume something unfair is at play. Because believing your growth came from consistent effort would remove their justification for staying the same. There's also fear in watching someone evolve. Growth changes dynamics. It shifts power. The person who once doubted themselves becomes decisive. The one who once tolerated chaos becomes selective. The one who once followed becomes independent. That shift can destabilize people who were comfortable with your old position. When you no longer need approval, control over you weakens. When you no longer fear isolation, manipulation loses its grip. When you no longer depend on external validation, criticism loses its sting. That kind of transformation feels threatening. And when people feel threatened, they look for narratives that protect their ego. They label your discipline as obsession, your focus as coldness, your ambition as arrogance, your self-respect as distance. But growth is not betrayal. It's alignment. You aligned your actions with your potential. You aligned your standards with your self-worth. You aligned your habits with your goals. And alignment creates momentum. Momentum is hard to stop once it begins. So those who refuse to move may try to slow you down with doubt, sarcasm, or subtle resistance. Not because they hate you, but because your movement reminds them of their stillness. And stillness, when chosen out of fear rather than peace, becomes heavy to carry. There's a difference between chasing power and radiating it. Chasing looks desperate. It runs, it begs, it negotiates for recognition. Radiating doesn't move toward validation. It attracts it without trying. Most people exhaust themselves trying to appear powerful. They collect titles, display achievements, broadcast every win. They measure their worth by how many people are watching. But the moment the audience disappears, so does their sense of control. You stopped performing. You realize that real power isn't in being seen. It's in being solid. It's in knowing that even if no one applauds, you're still standing on something unshakable. That shift changes everything. When you no longer chase approval, you become selective about where your energy goes. You don't argue to win, you speak to clarify. You don't compete for attention, you focus on growth. You don't force opportunities, you position yourself and let alignment do the work. And that restraint feels magnetic. People sense when someone isn't trying to impress them. It creates curiosity. Why aren't you trying? Why aren't you proving yourself? Why don't you seem concerned about being validated? Because you've already validated yourself. That internal approval system is what makes your energy steady. You don't rise too high with praise, and you don't sink too low with criticism. You listen, you process, you adjust if necessary, but you don't crumble. Stability is rare, and rarity draws attention. Radiating power also means you don't overextend. You understand that saying no protects your focus. You understand that not every invitation deserves acceptance. You understand that access to your time is valuable. People who chase power say yes to everything that looks important. People who radiate power choose what aligns, and choice is influence. When you move intentionally, others begin to adjust around your pace. They wait for your response. They value your agreement. They notice your absence. Not because you demanded importance, but because you didn't. There's confidence in detachment. When you're not desperate for outcomes, you operate with clarity. Decisions aren't driven by fear of missing out. They're driven by long-term vision. That kind of thinking feels strategic, almost intimidating, to those who act impulsively. You don't need to announce your worth. You demonstrate it through consistency, through discipline, through boundaries that don't bend under pressure. And the more consistent you are, the more your presence carries weight. Power that radiates doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't seek dominance through intimidation. It simply exists in a grounded state of self-trust. And self-trust changes posture, tone, rhythm. It slows your movements. It deepens your voice. It sharpens your eye contact. It reduces unnecessary words. All subtle signals that communicate control without ever claiming it. People often mistake this for mystery. But it's not mystery. It's alignment between belief and behavior. When your actions match your standards, there's no internal conflict, no nervous energy, no overcompensation. That congruence creates calm authority. Chasing power creates noise. Radiating power creates gravity. One demands attention. The other pulls it naturally. And the more you detach from proving yourself, the stronger that gravity becomes. Because when someone doesn't need the spotlight, they become the reason it shifts in their direction. You don't hunt for influence. You build yourself until influence becomes a byproduct.